Thank you. Just came out last month. There's a dispute with the publishers about it coming out in the format that it has, but if you can download it off the Pirate Bay for nothing, good for you. Yes. As an alternative business model, basically, I would say, if the publishers only want to publish this as a hardback at £60 and your library gets a copy, then I'm happy for you to download it for free. That's, I think, the most ideal business model. Okay, to start with the picture here, it's actually it's not reproduced on page 2 of the book, because what's actually reproduced on page 2 of the book is a copy that's currently in an art gallery in Swansea. Now, you might think, okay, here's a painting, painted in 1781 by Henry Fuseli. He sold the copyrights, reproduction rights, to a printer, who then made lithographic reproductions and sold them. They were very popular, and he never got a second payment. He wanted to go back and get a second payment as they made a second round of copies, but the printer already had the copyright deal, so he wouldn't pay Fuseli any more money. So Fuseli then painted the painting again and sold the rights to another version of the painting. And he did that quite a few times. There were pirates as well. Within a few months of him originally making the first copy, copies of the lithographic reproduction were circulating around Europe, which actually made Fuseli relatively famous. They made this piece of art a household name across Europe, made him quite a, well, as kind of one of the early romantic sort of movement figures. So he benefited in many respects, but the way of actually getting paid was to make multiple copies of his own picture and then sell the copyright again and again and again. Something that actually, if you were an artist today, a musician, you would be unable to do. It would be a criminal offence for you to record, to sell to record something else with another record company. The first record company you'd signed with would have rights over all your subsequent work within the time frame of the contract that you had with them. So interestingly, in the 200 or so years since the painting of this picture, the extension of copyright and the further development of copyright in the alleged interest of artists, I think, can be said to have actually had exactly the opposite effect. And that's kind of what I'm interested to talk about today, but mainly in relation to music. Okay, we talk about the digital revolution, and if we think about music, well, if you think about the development of computers and personal computers in the 70s and 80s, in relation to music and storage, well, we see the development of the compact disc in 1982. So digital recording stored in a new format. We see in the development of the MP3 format in, I think, 1989 as a means of compression, with further developments in the internet and the web in the 90s. And in 1999, you see perhaps the first significant case of convergence with Napster, basically bringing together those elements of storage, transmission, compression, enabling a much more ready distribution. Okay, now in that period between 1982 and 1999, there is a perfect storm for the music industry. The advent of the CD reduced production costs significantly. It required audiences to reformat, so people went out and bought all their greatest hits from whenever, and continued to buy new music. There was still a significant degree of monopoly control. Costs were reduced, increased speed and flexibility, but it also actually witnessed a period of vertical and horizontal integration within the music industry, so major labels being bought up by bigger corporate conglomerates, and major labels themselves buying up other parts of the music industry, independent labels, publishing houses, etc., etc. So you saw a huge profit storm in the music industry, an unprecedented and continued period of profit making, and despite the fact that people were well aware at the time that they were giving away their master copies. So in effect, their digital copies were their originals, and they were giving them away. And people commented on it, but they were actually doing very well, so the money was rolling in, and people were busy carrying on making a lot of money. You saw a slight dip in the mid-90s with the development of affordable CD burners, so people became able to start making their own copies, but that was a relatively minor blip. But it's really from 1999 onwards that you see profits in the music industry decline, or the recording industry decline radically. Now, an interesting parallel in this regard is with football. 10 years on exactly from the development of the CD, you see the development of satellite-based television subscription. And in the period between 1992 and 2009, again, nice little 17-year, one decade on parallel, you see an unprecedented profit storm in football. In England in particular, the English Premier League, which emerged at that exact point, witnessed huge flows of cash through digital television subscription rights deals. And bang on 17 years, 10 years on after the advent of Napster, you see the 17-year feast come to an end, and last year we saw the bankrupting of Setanta, in large measure because assuming a monopoly on the market and assuming a monopoly over rights of access to live sport, Setanta heavily overbid in terms of its rights package with the Premiership. And, well, bargaining on the fact that in a recession people might still pay because their subscription deal was cheaper than going out, they didn't bargain for the fact that people could actually access this material free. And services like Justin TV, live streaming, have actually come along now to parallel file sharing. And actually I think there's a very interesting study to be done to look at whether any lessons have been learned by the football industry in their kind of mirror of what's gone on in recorded music. So far it seems as though they've learned nothing. So we can just cry in the wind and well, they can go down the tubes just like the major labels, which as a policy might be quite good anyway. Okay, so what is the mainstream economic model that was kind of in operation? Well, as I mentioned with Fuseli's painting, a copyright and royalties model, assuming control, a monopoly over rights of reproduction. That right to monopoly control, enabling the ability to charge, make a profit from sales of reproductions. Now, in that period from the 80s through the 90s, what was witnessed was a very significant process of integration. Independent labels were bought up. Sony, Universal, Time Warner and EMI all pursued a strategy rather than actually developing their own new and original talent, would wait until an independent label had developed an act and then buy up the whole label. So rather than, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and to an extent in the early 80s, you had a kind of concertina process going on in recorded music, that you'd see new, independent, innovative record labels emerging, building up, and then you'd see the field being concentrated, and then you'd see a new wave of music, often coinciding with kind of the development of new rock genres, musical genres. But you'd see this concertina effect. But in the 80s, due to the large availability of money, it became easier for the major labels to simply buy up the competition. So buying up the independent labels and just integrating them into their own existing models. This kind of process of integration facilitated by large amounts of money. The five functions, if you like, of the record label as is currently existing in production, in terms of the idea of the producer developing the act, developing the music, actually recording in the studio, etc. So the sort of Phil Spector or the Berry Gordy Jr. or the Sam Kings, or all the sort of iconic figures, or Brian Eno and people like that. That sort of production function, the manufacture function, distribution, promotion and rights management. Again, interestingly, in the period of the 1980s through to the early 2000s, well, up until now really, all of the major publishing companies in music were bought up by the major recording labels. Jeffrey Hull, in a study of all of the significant genres in the US and comparable studies in Europe and the UK, have shown that what used to be a fairly separated relationship between rights management and the recording industry has now been totally brought in-house. And that's because you can cross-collateralize. If you sign a contract with an artist and they don't manage to recoup from the small percentage that you give them on all the costs you've set against their small advance or their royalties that they can pay that advance off with, then you can take the money out of their publishing rights. if you own the publishing rights company. If the publishing rights company is separate, then you can't cross-collateralize. So again, there's been a process of integration, or there was a process of integration. So basically, the economic model that was existing up until very recently, and it still is the predominant business model of the recording industry, was one that basically brought everything in-house, was very highly controlled, highly centralized, highly structured, and highly to the interest of the recording industry rather than, well, you might say, well, does the artist not benefit from that? And the evidence is that, well, the artist doesn't. That model where royalties are used to pay back a large proportion of the cost involved in production and promotion, well, if you pay the artist 10% of the retail value, which isn't actually the retail value because retail gets offset against all kinds of other spurious and long since out-date costs like breakages, that's kind of a built-in kind of clause that's to do with Bakelite or something, but doesn't really have any, well, anyway, it cuts your repayments down. But anyway, if you're getting about 10% of the net sale, but against the 10% of the net sale, you're then meant to pay back all of the production costs and all of the promotional costs, which often involve the cost of tours, the cost of videos, the cost of a number of other, well, lots of other things as well, then chances are you'll never pay back. You seem like $1 million. Well, interesting studies. Brian Holmes, for example, in Europe, of 100,000 members of the Recording Rights Association in France, only 2.5% of them have voting rights. Now, voting rights are recorded if you manage to have an income of more than 5,000 euros a year from your recording rights. So only 2.5% of those members of that organisation achieve that. And that's basic. That's the basic subsistence kind of unemployment benefit level. Steve Albini, interesting kind of looking at, well, if you sold a gold disc, so you're selling 250,000 albums, set against the kind of advance that you might receive, which is then used to pay for promotion and production costs. Well, assuming over a 4-year period you pay yourself half the salary of somebody working in a Circle K convenience store, then yes, by the end of your 4-year period, chances are you owe the record company money because they've offset all of their costs against your royalties, and they've then taken the remaining 90% and used that to offset against actually quite significantly lower costs for manufacture and distribution. Courtney Love, it's a similar model for looking at platinum selling, so like sell 1 million records. Well, by that stage, yes, you are actually going to be able to pay yourself about as much as if you were working full-time in a convenience store. So you think, well, why would anybody sign? Why would anybody sign a contract with such an onerous organisation as a publisher? You think, well, because it gets you invited to do live performance.
Are you getting paid?
Well, yeah, well, that's... I don't even get paid for it, but no. But yeah, the only viable reason, well, there are a very, very tiny number of individuals make more money from recording than they do from live performance. Alan Kruger in, I think it was 2004, estimated that it was only Eminem and Ozzy Osbourne who made more money from reproduction rights, because Ozzy Osbourne was basically doing his TV show and because Eminem didn't tour that year. But basically, live performance is where people make money in the recording industry, where artists make money. Sale of recorded material does not make money for artists. It's, well, a very, very, very small number of individuals. I mean, it's a few dozen, really, could actually make a living out of live recorded music. But that model is then held up as being a viable model. Well, it is for the recording industry, but it's not for artists. Artists get paid to perform, just like lecturers get paid to give lectures, and they get their jobs because they write books. They don't make money from books. They make money from getting jobs as lecturers, and they get jobs as lecturers because they've done recordings. But it's not a viable business model. You couldn't live on that kind of money. So what's interesting now is that under the threat of, a threat to the recording industry's model of making money, you've seen an introduction of these 360-degree contracts, in part linked up to this issue of cross-collateralization, so that by owning the publishing companies, the record company can then take the money from your publishing deal. Also, they'll try and tie you into your performance as well. So 360-degree contracts try to actually extract a larger proportion of the money that artists can make from live performance as well. Basically trying to introduce the same level of onerous lack of reward into every aspect of the recording of an artist's activities as they currently experience with recording. And basically set against the standard business model or the mainstream economic model, the alternatives seem actually rather attractive, despite the threat that they pose to the existing way of making a living if you're a record company. Okay, so most people are familiar with the history. So initial systems, the sharer identification and shared through a hub. So Napster, when it was first developed in 1999, you not only had to go through the central server of Napster to connect to identify other sharers, but you also had to go through their central server to actually exchange files. Now, that had legal ramifications. It meant that Napster could be prosecuted for contributory, whatever it was, contributory. Pardon me?
Infringement.
Infringement, yes, contributory infringement. They were effectively fencing stolen goods, so they had their fingerprints all over the stolen stuff, so effectively Napster could be closed down. The consequence of that was not to actually inhibit the development of file sharing, rather to simply encourage systems that enabled a distribution such that sharers could share files independently of the software provider that was giving them the means by which they could share. But systems like Kazaa and the early Morpheus required that sharers went through that central server to identify other users. So it was easy to trace and to track those individuals. Interestingly, the kind of, well, big sort of case last couple of years, a woman, Jamie Thomas, in the United States, she was convicted, then got off on appeal, and then was reconvicted for making available 9 files using the Kazaa system. An interesting back and forth in terms of whether or not making something available is the same as distribution. So if it's deemed illegal to distribute, whether or not making something available is distribution. That was one of the kind of arguments that went back and forth through the court. She was eventually convicted, but there's no possibility that she can pay the kind of fine that's been set against her. I don't know quite how that's actually panned out in the last few months. But anyway, she was using a system that was actually rather out of date, unfortunately for her. The consequence of various legal decisions regarding that was the development of software like, Nutella, and Morpheus was sort of reconfigured to use a kind of Nutella system of distribution, whereby you create a fully peer-to-peer system, so that peers no longer need to go through a central server to either identify other users or to exchange files. So in effect, the provider of the software can no longer be targeted directly as part of the actual infringement. It raised issues about whether or not making a software available that could be used for criminal purposes should itself be deemed illegal. Interestingly, there's been a back and forth in legal cases, but there is a tendency to focus back towards this sort of Sony ruling. I'm sure people are familiar with this notion that Sony in 1984, the Motion Picture Association of America took Sony to court in 1984 for including a record button on their video recorders. Because a record button, everyone knows, enables you to record. And recording enables you to infringe copyright. And therefore, the Motion Picture Industry Association of America concluded that Sony was engaging in an illegal activity by supplying these criminal objects. That ruling, well, the Sony ruling in 1984, Supreme Court in America decided that it was not a criminal offence to supply something that could be used for criminal purposes, as long as it could be reasonably used for non-criminal purposes. So, for example, you could go into, there are shops that sell little tiny scales and little enormous kind of cigarette papers, which of course could be used for making little dolls' houses and putting wallpaper up in little dolls' houses. Most people will use them for smoking cannabis, but it's not illegal to sell very small scales or enormous cigarette papers because they have dual use, they have an alternative potential. And likewise, transit vans can be used for robbing banks, but they can also be used by police to chase people who are robbing banks. So back and forth. The issue of whether or not supplying a software that enables criminal activity, well, that's bounced back and forth. It's something that might come up within the Digital Economy Bill. It was something that was actually raised in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and it did seem for a time that the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in 1998 had already preempted the criminalisation of something like Napster. But actually, in hindsight, that kind of, to impose that level of interpretation such that anything that could be used for criminal purposes should itself be illegal, would be, well, it would stifle innovation. It would basically prevent any kind of development of any kind of technology. So there's been a tendency to err on the side of caution in interpretation. Having said that, people have still been prosecuted, and from peer-to-peer forms of distribution, with the supplier, the software supplier, kind of largely being taken out of liability, the target became the person sharing. Now, if you go into the library, and you'll see a big poster, and it's the Copyright Licensing Agency will tell you that you're not allowed to photocopy that whole book. So you're not allowed to photocopy this whole book. But if each of you went and photocopied 5% of the whole book, and then shared it amongst yourselves, who would have actually been committing a criminal offence? And of course, that's the foundation for peer-to-peer or torrent-based systems, such that once the emphasis of prosecution shifted to uploaders, then you simply create a system whereby nobody actually supplies the whole thing. Everybody supplies a part of the whole thing. There have been attempts, and obviously the prosecutions last year of the Pirate Bay directors is a case in point, where again there's been an attempt to try and clamp down on peer-to-peer forms of distribution, although it's not the peer-to-peer distributors that are actually being prosecuted, it's the people who've set up the system. And again, that bounces back to the question of, well, who's liable? But that, I think, has really only led to the encouragement of a shift away from downloading entirely towards forms of live streaming, so that actually, not only are you not getting a copy from one person, but you're not actually getting a copy from anybody, because you're just looking at it. So unless you were to criminalise the radio, or criminalise people for what basically fit little kind of like DRM devices to people's ears, they're actually just simply not copying, but just listening or just experiencing. I mean, what does it mean to actually just simply have something on your screen? You're not taking a copy of it, you're just experiencing it. Well, it'll be interesting to see. In regards to football, the FA and the Premiership have attempted to bring cases against live streaming providers. The difficulty is that the live streaming provider is, as long as they take the site down after it's been reported, they can't be prosecuted. But of course, by the time that's been processed, the live event has already finished. So again, it makes it very difficult to pursue. But basically, all of the legal strategies that have kind of emerged have failed. And so, in the absence of a kind of a legal defence of intellectual property, there are potentially technical solutions or cultural solutions, or maybe there are economic strategies, alternative economic strategies that could be adopted. Now, I've already mentioned some of these kind of elements in the winner-loses sort of approach to legal strategies. Every attempt to introduce a legal prohibition has simply encouraged the development of law-compliant or law-evading alternative technologies. Now, I've already mentioned this little potted history. It's an interesting question about liability because it carries on back and forth, back and forth. Are you liable because you've made it available? Are you liable because you're the one who actually made a copy, so you're the downloader rather than the uploader? Are you liable because you are the person who supplied the software that enables the transaction? Are you liable because you're the internet service provider? This goes back and forth, and there hasn't really been any successful prohibition. It hasn't worked.
Could you say 2 words, perhaps, how is technically the live streaming conducted, or how does it take place?
Technically, I don't think I'd probably be the best person to say technically.
Not technically, but how is it done?
Well, if I'm watching, I don't know, a particular football match,
yes,
on my computer or on my television, which, thank you very much, due to the government's kind of wonderful attempt to sell off all the analog broadcast channels, is now integrated into my computer because it's had to go digital. I can now then upload that live stream. So I'm watching it and I'm just uploading it on my computer.
But how are the person supplying the live stream able to broadcast?
Well, they send it to something like Justin TV, and Justin TV is then going to act as a hub through which people can download. Now, you might say that's surely reintroducing the notion of a hub, which can then be prosecuted. But because Justin TV has no editorial control over what it is that people do on Justin TV, as long as they deactivate that stream when they have it recorded, when the FA reports that I've been uploading, or that you as Justin TV have been enabling me to distribute the football match that the FA have rights over, well, as long as I, as Justin TV, close that channel down, then I'm no longer liable. Unless you ascribe to something like Justin TV an editorial kind of function, that it's required to have editorial control over everything it displays. And as soon as you go down the route of saying that an internet service provider or a channel or any kind of medium on the internet is required to undertake editorial control over its content, then you destroy the whole function of the internet. And it would be very difficult, I think, to persuade any lawmakers to say that would be the case. So at the moment, as it stands, the suppliers of these live streaming channels are not liable for the content, as long as they're prepared to take it off when infringing content is deemed to have been displayed through their channels. And because it's live streaming, they can do that, but only after the event has occurred. So that's the sticking point. But I don't think it's likely to be prohibited. If it were, then that would be a major infringement of all kinds of, well, technical innovation or any possibility of innovation. And it's unlikely that anybody would try and go down that route, I don't think. Sorry.
Just to make another comment, when you're streaming or in any way downloading anything over the internet, de facto your browser is making a copy on your computer.
Mm-hmm.
So anything to do with that, it's always been a question that I've asked myself is, how can these people talk about copyright infringement when the only way that you can view their software is that they've given you a license to infringe their copyright because they've allowed your browser to make a copy of it?
Interesting, yes. And the question of who's making the copy, if it's the person downloading, then that makes it very difficult. And
no, it's my browser that's making the copy.
I see, all right, so it's actually back to this, all right, so that's actually, yeah, so your computer is breaking the law, but you're not.
Yes, and my browser suppliers, good old Microsoft, are in the firing line.
Well, there's an interesting...
This is what Ethiopol argued in the 80s, that that's what computers do, they make copies.
Yeah.
But he talked about a service right rather than a copyright or something to try to avoid that. But push on. And
okay, it's an interesting point. Okay, so technical solutions. Well, it's been commonly suggested, whether in the film industry, the music industry, the computing industry, that we are on the brink of developing a great new technical solution. In 1998, it was announced that, after the G8 summit, I think it was, that a new device had come about that was going to be able to scan your MP3 player or your iPod at airports to find out if you've got any copyright infringing materials on your iPod or whatever else. It transpired that this was a bit of a myth, but anyway, as have all the other attempts back through the ages. So if there's hard digital rights management in terms of encryption and soft digital rights management in terms of surveillance technologies that try and identify infringement behavior, all of these have tended to be, well, rather overplayed, and actually in exaggerating their hand, the music and film industries have actually rather discredited their own case. No one believes anything they say, basically. So I think the history of the CD. Well, the CD, compact disc, because it was, I think, developed simultaneously and released simultaneously by Sony and Philips, they weren't able to identify or agree a common format for any kind of encryption, so the CD remains unencrypted. There were attempts with the mini disc to develop an encryption, but precisely because that would have required control by whoever it was that designed and sold the discs, record companies and other suppliers, well, the record companies weren't keen to actually sign up to a single deal. It was actually interesting that it was only the advent of unauthorized file sharing that actually compelled or enabled the record companies to be persuaded to distribute to something like iTunes. DVDs, well, yeah, they were encrypted for a while, but actually that encryption was readily broken. Jon Johansen was prosecuted a number of times unsuccessfully for identifying a key to break the encryption on DVDs, and then he put it on the internet. I think he went to a conference in the United States and he wore it on a T-shirt. And there was some issue to do with whether or not he'd actually imported this criminal code on his T-shirt. But anyway, he claimed that he'd only developed the key in order to be able to make copies of his favourite CDs onto, I don't know, alternative format. So maybe he wanted to listen to it in his car or onto his MP3 player, or whatever it was. It's an interesting question about transfer, whether or not it's actually legal. In the United States, it is legal to make copies to put onto your alternative kind of, like put it onto tape to listen to in the car, for example. Technically in Britain, I don't know that it actually is. But precisely because it's commonly assumed that if it's lawful in America, it must be lawful everywhere else, because America writes all the world's laws. Well, because that isn't actually true, but precisely because a lot of people believe it's true, it will be almost impossible to try and enforce the absence of that law in this country, and in other countries as well. Anyway, Jon Johansen managed to evade prosecution. Interestingly, a couple of years later, he was also instrumental in repeatedly breaking the Fair Play digital rights management software that was being used by iTunes. Now, when iTunes originally signed up with the major record labels, they were only prepared to allow their music to be licensed through iTunes if it was digitally rights managed. Now, from the word go, that digital rights management was totally flawed, didn't really work. Anybody with a modicum of kind of ingenuity or awareness of where to go could easily evade that, but then again, they wouldn't be going to iTunes if they knew how to get it for free anyway, if that's what they wanted to do. Interestingly, Steve Jobs was comfortable for a while with operating Fair Play. It was regularly being broken. Jon Johansen kind of released a number of versions of keys. Every time they tried to make patches, the patches were then broken. Steve Jobs had actually been arguing for a long time that he was being unfairly hindered by the operation of Fair Play, because he claimed that the record companies were selling CDs in an unencrypted format in direct competition with his iTunes format, which they required him to encrypt. So he, in a way, was being hampered from selling product by the very people who were selling the same product in a different format that people were more willing to buy because it was unencrypted. So to an extent, Jon Johansen enabled Steve Jobs to kind of turn around to the record companies and say, look, game's up, not my fault, I can't stop it, we're just going to have to get rid of Fair Play. And when that happened in 2007, all the four major labels who had claimed that they would pull the plug on iTunes if they went non-DRM didn't do so, and they've all gone along with it. It apparently, I've been told today, this hasn't had a significant impact on their sales, which is an interesting point. So it does kind of raise the question of whether digital rights management in the hard form actually has any effect. It doesn't seem to have had any effect. It doesn't work, and the idea of it, no one really believes it. So you might just pretend that you can't do it, but no one believes that either. So soft DRM, surveillance. Maybe people believe that you can do it, but if you do it, they'll catch you. Well, this again is a kind of cat and mouse situation. Banerjee et al. Is a nice study where, yes, there are lots of block list ranges of kind of websites that if your computer goes to them, then they're actually proxies for the music industry, and you'll be flagged up as being a potential infringer if your computer searches out these particular websites. But it's relatively straightforward to block very large amounts of these websites. Of course, the record companies will come up with new proxies, but it's a cat and mouse game. They're trying to surveil the internet. Counter-surveillance strategies can operate whereby you can load up the latest version of this software, which will kind of help you avoid those kind of sites. So the idea that surveillance would be a single kind of panacea to the music industry, well, if it existed, if you could have a genuinely pervasive surveillance technology, well, that would immediately be available to be used by the other side. So they could then surveil, counter-surveil, identify who was surveilling. So it's two sides of the same coin, that if you could have solid encryption, it would be a nightmare for the music industry because they could never find out what you were exchanging. So yeah, okay, fair enough. Your latest album is totally encrypted, but all I need to do is stick a microphone next to the speaker, and it wouldn't be that difficult to get a reasonable copy, and then I can circulate it all around the world with a totally deep encryption that no one can break, so you can never prosecute me. So if digital rights management at the hard end worked, it would be a nightmare for the music industry. It doesn't work, and they've got a nightmare of their own. Surveillance, likewise, it's two sides of the same coin. If it worked, it would work for both sides equally. So it doesn't really offer that much of an advantage either. Now, the question then is culturally. You might not be able to criminalise successfully and prosecute everybody, or even prosecute many people successfully. You might not be able to technically prevent them from doing it. But maybe you could just pretend. You could persuade them. Now, early on, you had this wonderful comment here: piracy funds terrorism and will destroy our society and your future enjoyment. So not only will your society be destroyed, but you won't even be able to come home and enjoy nice fun. If society was destroyed, it's quite what people would be enjoying. I don't know. It was kind of. But anyway, the claim was that that piracy was funding terrorism. Now, this claim, it's true, if you accept that one former Northern Irish paramilitary organisation had some people who were found to have kind of been engaged in the sale of dodgy DVDs to fund their nefarious future post-terrorist activities. But, well, were they terrorists? Well, it was after the Good Friday Agreement. These were people engaging in another form of criminal behaviour. They'd gone straight to another kind of, well, maybe they weren't terrorists anymore. But certainly the impression that somehow Al-Qaeda is kind of selling dodgy DVDs to fund flying lessons. You know, that Del Boy and Rodney kind of, was it London, Paris, Tora Bora, or whatever, in a little van. Yeah, this sort of myth didn't really last very long. It kind of led to, well, a large discrediting of those who were making those sorts of claims. So again, not particularly helpful. Now, is there a mouse that I can actually use to... Does this actually... So if I...
It should be right behind you. There on
Ah.
Yeah, there. Yeah. Just pick it up. Yeah.
Oops. Okay.
On your desktop or something.
There you go. Oh no, you've come out of
Okay. So I want to... Okay, let's go into the... No. Okay. All right. Okay. So we'd hope then that the cultural industries would be good at persuading us with cultural strategies. So there's a few kind of... this is probably one that everybody's familiar with.
Could you put it up full screen, please?
Yep. It's, oh,
Bottom right. That little
This one?
square.
okay, so strategy number one, piracy. Piracy is bad. You'll be in trouble. I'm sure people are familiar. There's a parody version of that same advertisement. So if the cultural strategy of the music industry is to try and persuade you that piracy is a crime, then what's interesting is that I think it's actually had quite a lot of, well, the opposite effect, that has actually encouraged people to take their claims. So, as a cultural strategy, it kind of assumes that people will simply take the reading that has been offered, whereas I think actually the opposite is evidently true. Now, what sort of started as a sort of an attempt to say, it's a crime, you'll get caught, it's bad, kind of creates all of its own sort of counter-strategies and subversions. And actually, but what's interesting is that claims initially that were made that piracy funds terrorism kind of migrate into a sort of a... Now what's going on?
Go to the first tab, right above the YouTube symbol. Yeah, right there.
Ah, okay.
And they steal all our internet. These pirates can bust into our hackers' homes, make us walk the plank, steal our rocket tubes, and leave us broke. And you know what that means? No cash, no inspiration. No inspiration, no rocket sauce. No rocket sauce, no kick-ass rock and roll. And they steal. Is that what you want, Mr. Monkey John Silver? What's your parrot gonna listen to when you go toe-to-toe against the English or much? Chaz? I don't think so. Make us walk the plank, steal our rocket, stop pirates, and leave us broke. And you know what that means? No cash, no inspiration. No inspiration, no...
Now, I don't actually know if that's meant to be a parody website or an actual recording industry website. It's, yeah. Oops. Okay, so now we get to kind of the scraping of the bottom of the barrel, I think. This is kind of a... This is the latest sort of... Now these are the people who are meant to be at the leading edge of cultural creativity in society today. They've kind of like given up on the idea that we'll believe them when we say that we're funding terrorists. And that we've kind of like, there were strategies that tried to explain that all these kind of things were linked to illegal migrants. So there was a series of bus adverts on sides of buses with rats coming in and out of drains, and then being associated with illegal immigrants selling dodgy DVDs, which were then immediately taken off and, well, they're deemed rather offensive and inappropriate. But anyway, finally, this is a parody of the knockoff Nigel. The knockoff Nigel seems to be the, really, they've hit the skids in terms of demonstrating their creative genius. But anyway, this is a parody of knockoff Nigel.
He's the type of man that likes things nice and cheap. He evens the score with those industry creeps. He's found a way which sticks it to the man. He unloads knockoff films while a clever little man. He's a knockoff Nigel, a knockoff Nigel. Knockoff Nigel downloads knockoff films. He's nobody's fool.
So, yes, if on the one hand we're not persuaded legally, we're not persuaded technically, well, certainly if these are the best things that the cultural industries can create, not only does it suggest that we're not going to be persuaded by their arguments regarding file sharing, but it kind of undermines the whole argument that they're actually contributing to the cultural industry at all. I mean, if artists are being told that somehow 90% of the value generated by the sale of recorded music should go to the recording industry and not to the artist, you kind of think, well, okay, so these creative types must be brilliant. They must be able to turn rubbish into gold. But if we look at their cultural sort of strategies, it kind of begs belief. Now, the interesting thing I think here is that the one successful strategy that the cultural industries have adopted is the label piracy itself. So the claim that downloading materials off the internet is piracy. It's a dodgy claim. Copyright infringement and piracy are not necessarily the same thing. The laws have been changed in various ways, but piracy legally is commercially driven and commercially damaging. Now, downloading off the internet is not piracy by those criteria. But the music industry has the film industry has successfully labelled people who engage in these behaviours as pirates. And in so doing has actually generated a certain degree of cachet in the act of actually engaging in an infringement behaviour. What would have once just been considered just doing things on the cheap, is now seen as a radical, piratical strategy wherein there's actually a Knockoff Nigel parody of another one. There's another Knockoff Nigel film where they're in a pub and Knockoff Nigel buys his girlfriend a watch from the kind of like the street trader, and the girlfriend puts it in a glass of wine because she thinks he's not cheap. But the parody is kind of like done to a sort of a theme of be a pirate, haha, pirates are free, pirates kind of like change the world and pirates don't get controlled by the system. So actually even their one successful strategy, which is actually making the label pirate stick, is not necessarily very advantageous to the people who've actually undertaken that strategy, because piracy is cool, or at least that's what they seem to have successfully achieved. Okay, economic alternatives. Well, if the cultural strategies don't work and the technical strategies don't work and the legal strategies don't work, well, are there economic alternatives? Well, yes, there are. Alan Kruger at Yale, I think it is, refers to Bowie theory. Bowie theory is the notion that if people can get stuff for free, well, a network society where in effect recordings are available, people will now gain some cultural kind of value from things that aren't universally available. And live performance basically becomes the valued aesthetic form. That actually live performance is seen to be the creative space. That the live event is seen to be the thing. If you see kids with the little armbands on from all the different places they've been to, live performance is kind of, well, what Kruger had identified is a direct correlation between the decline in the sale of recorded music and the increase in prices for live performance and the volume of ticket sales for live performance. So because artists get paid a greater proportion of live performance revenues than they do from recording revenues, the only thing that artists should wish for is an ongoing decline in recording revenues, because if I put £10 in my pocket and only give you one, it's better that it doesn't go in my pocket, it just goes directly to the gate, and for which you probably get paid half. So what Kruger is suggesting is that actually the recording industry has no particular benefit to recording artists, to performing artists, and that actually there's an inverse relationship between sales of recorded music and the economic prosperity of musicians. Well, there's documentation of sort of a number of alternative models in the book. Basically, the record industry will often say, well, yes, but young artists, they don't really benefit because they're just starting out, and basically it's the really established artists who benefit the most. But then actually if you look at established artists, they're often breaking the mold as well and actually make more money by alternative strategies, at which point the record industry says, you're pulling up the ladder. You're starving the young and the new artists that, by being selfish. So when Radiohead released In Rainbows Online, the response was, oh, they're so selfish. That's just like, what's that blood-sucking thing that they released? Anyway, here's Radiohead making loads of money, and they're pulling up the ladder from all these young artists that kind of will need the benefit from the recording industry in the future. But interestingly, when those artists claim, well, they're not actually benefiting. So actually, Madonna, for example, signed a contract recently with her with Live Nation, because actually she'd make more money from live performance than she can from sales of her CDs. But actually, when Madonna first came to Britain, one of her CDs was roughly the same price as one of her concert tickets. The last time she came to Britain, you could buy her entire back catalogue for less than the price of one ticket. But of course, she's become famous in the meantime. But then again, the evidence is that the relative prices mean that artists will make a lot more money from live performance if they're established. So Radiohead, Madonna, Simply Red and the Charlatans are interesting examples of artists that are in not the twilight. I wouldn't like to say that they're that old, but they're not in the very spotlight, but they're living off their past glories. And again, the strategies that they've pursued actually suggest that artists would be better off not selling their recorded music and making a living from performance. And actually there's been a massive growth recently of older artists who weren't getting paid from the long tail of their recorded work, coming back and touring and actually making a better living. So bands like Enter Shikari, Arctic Monkeys demonstrate that actually there are alternative models for younger artists. Madonna and Radiohead illustrate that actually you're better off bypassing record companies if you're actually at the peak of your career, and that Simply Red and the Charlatans illustrate that actually if you're in that sort of latter phase of your career, you'd be better off actually bypassing record companies. And it's interesting that at whichever particular group you are, the record companies will say, yeah, but we're not really primarily targeted to you. We're kind of more interested in the others. But if you look across the spectrum, he realised that actually they don't really provide much benefit anywhere. Okay, capitalist perestroika or something else? Well, what I would kind of conclude by suggesting is that, well, Castells is correct when he talks about capitalist adjustment, that the network society is something that, well, capitalist economies developed and adapted to and integrated with and forwarded more readily than their Soviet competitors in the kind of early years of the network society. And the collapse of the Soviet Union can be in some ways attributed, or at least in part kind of accelerated by failures to adapt militarily, politically, economically and culturally. And the triumph of a flexible network capitalism might kind of give the impression that, well, yes, capitalism is infinitely adaptable, infinitely flexible, and is the superior kind of a model. But I'd say this is only up to a point. What's interesting today is that the cultural industries are precisely the hierarchical bureaucratic defenders of monopoly control, which parallel the old Soviet kind of administrative arrangements that the network society in some respects undermined. Now, when Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he introduced a program of restructuring, but after a year, he realized that restructuring couldn't be undertaken without an element of openness. But unfortunately for the Soviet Union, that level of openness undermined the process of restructuring because it fostered criticism. And similarly, in the music industry, the adaptation to the network society, the release of music through digital formats, well, the restructuring was very successful, but the openness that it fostered can potentially also undermine it. And when faced with a much more adaptable, much more innovative, and I'd argue also more creative digital multitude, these institutions are in some ways teetering on the brink of the abyss. Now, whether this will actually simply mean an alternative capitalism, Rupert Murdoch, he's got his money on all the horses. In Castell's most recent work, he highlights the level of system integration amongst the big multimedia players. That Rupert Murdoch, he owns MySpace. He had the tie-in with MySpace. So he's actually perfectly flexible when it comes to making money off free content. But at the same time, with his newspaper group, he's trying to actually introduce some form of control over pay-to-access. He also controls, obviously, television channels, film companies. He's got a stake in kind of the music industry. He's got a stake in something like Sky with its subscription to football. But he's backing all the horses. So it's perfectly possible that we'll witness a capitalist perestroika, a reconstruction, a reconfiguring. The collapse of the music industry may simply see music become a free content that enables a company like Rupert Murdoch to charge for the advertising that you get clicked onto when you download free music. Alternatively, as I've suggested in a number of case studies, there are alternative self-managed systems, simply read with their sort of socialism on one website. That they can offer you, free little video. You get like a nice hotel package, come and see Mick Hucknall, stay in a fancy hotel, have roses on the bed when you arrive, get down, you have your little kind of like DVD of Mick Hucknall singing to Fidel Castro in Cuba. But all the money goes through simplyred.com because they're socialism in one website. Or the charlatans model where they give it away, or Radiohead model where they're effectively engaging in a form of self-production. So anyway, it's an open space for where things will go in the future, but I think I'd leave it there. If anyone's got any suggestions or comments.
I'm reminded in all of this of the earlier fights in the film industry in Hollywood. And what that led to was a film company known as United Artists,
Right.
which was exactly that. And in a sense, they went in for a form of community production and self-publishing. The same is happening in the book industry. The rise and rise of self-publishing is doing the same thing, and the same is happening in the music industry, where all these people who don't have recording contracts are encouraging this. And I think that in the end is the thing that's going to destroy all this, because, as you say, this defence of monopoly hierarchical bureaucracy is just not sustainable.
Yes. I mean, it's an interesting, the case of United Artists is an interesting one because in that sort of period, they, as three of the most powerful, was it Chaplin, Fairbanks and Mary Pickford? Yes.
But there were others.
Yes, but there's sort of leading figures and something like with Radiohead and Madonna leading the charge in some respects, then that possibility does certainly exist. Interestingly, the thing about United Artists was that they were unable, as a production company to gain a foothold in the distribution, which the other 5 majors at that time in the film industry were able to control. And it was only in the 1940s when that was kind of prohibited. But you're absolutely right. It's a really interesting example of an attempt, and there are parallels with the situation
and
today.
Rolling Stones have just taken their whole catalogue away from EMI, which illustrates that a really successful group is in charge of the contract.
Mm.
And that's the way that I think that all these groups will go.
Well, I met Billy Bragg on the train at one point. He was going up to Lancaster Prison to give out some guitars, and so I kind of like did an impromptu interview with him on the train. And he'd apparently, all the way through his career, he'd signed contracts where the copyright reverts to him after 7 years. And there's an interesting thing with this 360-degree contract, so that at the very time when record companies are actually suffering in their revenues from recording, they're trying to introduce a more onerous kind of contractual arrangement with artists, which will actually potentially have the effect of pushing more artists away from that kind of a model. So it's kind of a potential momentum that kind of accelerates itself.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
One of the solutions that's been mooted in the lead up to the Digital Economy Bill is a so-called download tax imposed upon ISPs, which then pass it on to end users. Kind of like the blank CD or media levy that was used in Canada and proposed over here at several points in previous decades. Do you think that such a model represents a step in the right direction? Would it work? Would it ensure that the industry is viable, or is that kind of a kind of tax-based approach inappropriate?
Well, if you were to introduce a tax level at the point of accessing the internet, the question of then how that might be redistributed to artists, why that would necessarily require record labels. I mean, interestingly, the question of the future viability of record labels hinges on whether or not they can control the distribution process, and that it's perfectly possible that that kind of a solution might be a viable method of distributing revenues to artists, but it would question the viability or the need for record companies to sit in the middle. And actually with the systems by which rewards are redistributed to artists from the sale, from the play of music on the radio or play of music in shops and restaurants and other locations. Again, as that becomes digitally integrated, it's actually much easier now to actually maintain a record of what's being played in shops and radio stations, etc. And again, as a way of distributing money to artists, that might be another viable kind of dimension. But again, it questions the need for record companies in the middle. Now, record companies claim that they have a series of functions, the producer function, the manufacturing, distribution, promotion, and rights management. But all of those are in doubt, actually, once kind of these alternatives come on stream. The only sort of thing that really means that artists will sign contracts now, today, I would say, is the promotion dimension. That it's only because record companies still have a large degree of control over whether or not you get access to the media, whether you get kind of reviewed in the music press, whether or not you get booked for the major venues. It's their control of that kind of avenue that means that you're still going to want to sign a contract with them such that they will actually take almost all of the revenues. But if you move in the direction that you're suggesting, well, and as various artists have demonstrated, you can bypass a large degree of the music industry's kind of control over promotion because the work's available through other media.
Let's see. Oh, you got the yes, Professor.
What do you think? You can hear me anyway, can't you?
I can.
It's for the video.
Yes. Yeah, it's not coming out. On the video.
Okay. What are your feelings about the future of things like Spotify, and what sort of revenues are they getting, and how are they being distributed?
Well, actually, I defer to my colleague, well, not colleague, but my person who's told me about this only today. My inclination, and I've been sort of confirmed in my inclination from what I'd already known, that Spotify isn't particularly successful as a commercial model. The question of why that should be, I mean, it's worth further investigation, but it's not generating the kinds of revenues, and the revenues, there's been disputes over the revenues going back to artists. And the question really, I think, is this. Why would you want to go down a route where you have all these mediations, when actually the only viable model by which artists have ever been paid in any significant number is through live performance? And actually, the nature of the nature of a network society might be that this work is available everywhere. But the fact is, the only time anyone ever gets, the only time that the artist really regularly gets paid is if they do it somewhere. So setting up a kind of a huge infrastructure whereby a tiny amount of revenue would return to the artist is, I don't think, of any particular significance to the artist. The evidence from Spotify is that the artists don't receive anything back of any substance. The revenues to Spotify aren't particularly significant either. Why would people go to Spotify when they've got to, in effect, give over large amounts of information about themselves in order for Spotify to then target them with adverts? If one of the reasons that people object to, one of the reasons people are supposed to object to downloading illegally is that their computers might be corrupted. Well, a lot of the anxiety could be equally expressed in relation to these kind of commercial operators that are effectively going to inject all kinds of Trojans and kind of cookies and things into your computer. So I can't see that that's I don't see why that would be attractive to artists, and I don't see why that would be attractive to audiences. And I would go back to sort of my main suggestion, which is that artists will get paid through live performance, that actually the networks are a means by which they get publicity. The freer that can be, the better it is for artists. And the audiences aren't necessarily benefiting from giving away information about themselves or being targeted by commercial actors through something like Spotify. So I can't see that it would be it's going to be commercially successful, and I don't see that it would be of particular use. I guess an underlying kind of suggestion that I would have is that a digital economy has to be abolished before you can have a digital society. That actually an information society should be a society based on the free access to information, upon which then people can then make decisions. Now, in economics, there's a big debate about whether or not information should be a commodity, or whether information should be the means by which people make decisions about what they're going to buy. And, well, Adam Smith kind of issues about freedom of information or free access to information. But it seems to me that free access to information is the best means by which artists will get paid. And that actually abolishing the information economy will be a great step forward, because record companies can still make a living by packaging things in an attractive fashion. When Radiohead released their album In Rainbows at $80 or £40 at the end of 2007, 100,000 people bought it in a week. Why? They'd all actually downloaded it off the internet, many of which downloaded it for free. Well, because they wanted the packaging and they wanted to identify with the artist. So there is a viable model for packaging, but you're not selling the information. The information is free, but you can sell your identification with the artist, you can sell the packaging, and you can sell the live event because it has some unique value. It has scarcity. And again, I think models that try to kind of build scarcity into their calculations are flawed. And I don't think you don't need scarcity to have an economy, ironically. It's one of the premises upon which so much of our economic thinking is based. And I think we need to think about a post-scarcity context. And there are perfectly legitimate and perfectly workable alternative business models that operate on the premise of post-scarcity. I, with my previous partner, bought a piece of art from an exhibition, from a gallery, from an auction in Dublin. And the thing is, you can buy that at Athena for a few pounds, but if you buy it from, and it's signed, it's not an original piece of art, it's a print, but it's got the artist's signature on the bottom. There are legitimate markets for all kinds of work, despite the fact that these things are still also freely available in another format. So I think that's what we need to pursue.
Thanks very much. Just a few comments on Spotify, which I think is quite interesting, because it's as near as the traditional economic model has come to finding a solution in this, in that it's offering both the paid-for option and the advertiser-supported option, so you get it for free if you're prepared to put up with the ads. The problem is that it just hasn't really worked in practice, and the point of the information I passed on earlier is that tiny proportion of Spotify users actually take the premium, and therefore just the volume of revenues is so low that the premium model isn't working. And the second point that Matthew was pointing to, for the advertising model to really work, at the moment it's just like radio advertising without the focused targeting of the advertisers, so that it's really not attracting the advertisers to identify the users in a way that's really useful. One thing I think I would say is that there is a thought that's floating around that people aren't quite as concerned about preserving their personal data, particularly the demographic that's attracted to Spotify, in the way that other parts of the population are. So maybe people are more prepared to deliver more data. This then can be handed on to advertisers who then can target them in models like Spotify. And if Spotify does manage to grow its reach to such an extent that it's less concerned about the very slim volumes that it's getting now, it might have a possibility going forward. So we'll just leave that as a possibility, but certainly at the moment all the anecdotal noise is that Spotify is losing a lot of money and is struggling to keep going over the longer term. What I would say is that a question for Matthew is that you put forward a proposition that talks about the elimination of the record labels as part in the value chain going forward, and I think it's quite a cogent thought, particularly pointing to independence and artists doing their own work and doing their own distribution, and effectively taking out everything that the record labels themselves do. The question is, does that work if you take that model to the movie industry, where the capital cost of running movie studios and the huge capital costs of blockbuster movies that comes out now, is it feasible to eliminate the movie studios in a way that your model eliminates the record companies? And we should bear in mind that the real force that's driving the attack on file sharing now and the everything to do with copyright infringement is really coming from the movie studios rather than the record labels. I think we can all recognise the record labels are a bit of a busted flush on this, but what's really made all the difference over the last 2 years or so has been the MPA, particularly the MPA, getting organised and lobbying governments around the world to attack the copyright infringement. And if that isn't deflected, or at least a different solution found, we can rest assured that the MPA aren't going to stop just because the music industry is under a bit of pressure.
No. Thanks very much. On the question of on Spotify, you're absolutely right that it's quite feasible. It could be the case that if people were prepared to be more flexible with their personal data, and as you say, it seems like a lot of teenagers will tell you where they're going to be on a Friday evening when their parents really say they shouldn't. So yes, the likelihood of them giving away what they happen to like to buy in the shops, they don't seem to be that concerned. So, and MySpace, Facebook, other kind of sort of systems, they do make money for their advertisers. Rupert Murdoch made a lot of money out of MySpace, so there is a commercial model. The fact that lots of universities use Facebook to try and target their prospective students, yeah, I mean, it's not inconceivable that model could work. I guess because of the existence of alternatives that are in many respects better, I would just suggest that it's less likely to work when the alternatives work better. On the question of movies, it's an interesting mix. As we've seen with, well, I haven't seen it yet, in fact I don't think I will, but Avatar, I mean, apparently they have the biggest grossing movie of all time every year, because the ticket prices go up. But the fact that ticket prices go up is illustrative of the fact that the movies, well, back to the United Artists, that in the 20s and beyond, up until 1948, the big studios controlled all the cinemas. In 1948, the studio system was in part kind of regulated, and there was controls, precisely to actually reflect a criticism of the kind of monopoly dominance of that sector. And actually the United States was after the defeat of Japan and Germany, they actually, one of the reasons for the breaking up of the big monopolies was that it was claimed that these big sort of corporate monopoly controls were instrumental in the fomenting of war. And that it's interesting that from the 40s, when copyright was largely and intellectual properties were kind of like largely sort of pressed to one side, up through to the 1980s, where suddenly the United States becomes obsessed with pressing every extension of copyright, both nationally and internationally. But anyway, in regards to the movies, you had this whole kind of period from 1948, the advent of television, that had a major declining impact on the cinema attendances, up through to the 80s, where cinema attendance was kind of at its all-time low. And then you see a kind of a renaissance in cinema, the development of spaces, multiplexes, the redevelopment of cinema. That cinema has seen growing attendances ever since in Britain since about 1984. So Ghostbusters and Top Gun. Now, you might say that actually the kind of the, what's it called, high content? No. Steven Spielberg is the absolute exemplar of high. Pardon me? It is the blockbuster concept, yeah, but it's called high concept. And high concept is low concept. High concept is that the little guy who can pitch the story in 30 seconds. There's going to be like a ring, and there's going to be a lord, and there's going to be lots of fighting, and that's the pitch. But high concept, the idea is it's Jaws, it's Star Wars, it's Top Gun, it's kind of blockbusters, it's Avatar, you know, it's got a mega 3D super space fight, whatever. But yeah, since the 80s, with the advent of the multiplex, cinema revenues have gone up and up and up. And despite the fact that you can download this stuff, despite and in many respects, you may see, and I think you will see a bifurcation, because there'll be art cinema, which will kind of have its own kind of audience, its own kind of performance spaces. There'll be there's been a rejuvenation of theatre in some respects. You've seen a lot of kind of like artists, actors reorienting towards theatre as a way of gaining some credibility at a time when cinema is deemed to be quite low esteem because it's cheesy, because actually blockbuster, these high concept movies aren't very, the content's not, there's no narrative development, there's not much character development, it's just bing bang boom, and if Arnold Schwarzenegger can say the lines, there's not really a lot of dialogue. But cinema is actually, I think, because it's reoriented to the cinema, and that it's, in some ways there's a parallel to the live performance space. It's not live, but it can actually, it's a revenue model. As to the MPAA's viability as a lobby group, in the last 10 years, I'd say it's been, well, the last 30 years, it's actually lost most of its strategic battles. I mean, it lost against the video recorder. Interestingly, the video recorder coincided with the Sony ruling coincided with the rebirth of cinema, because it was at that point they thought, well, we've lost the battle around home recording, we'll have to reorient towards the cinema, which they did successfully, although the actors and the screenwriters' disputes that have gone on in Hollywood in the last couple of years have been all to do with revenues returned from non-theatre performance. So there's massive issues and conflicts going on there. Jack Valante's death a couple of years ago, he was in one of the little shots. I don't know if you recognise Jack Valante, the person who brought you the Sony conflict, the person who brought you the claim that piracy causes terrorism, funds terrorism. I don't know if people are familiar, but Jack Valante was kind of, he's the little guy in the background in Lyndon Johnson, when Lyndon Johnson's getting sworn in after the assassination of Kennedy. In the background, there's kind of Jack Valante, a long-time, lifelong Democrat lobbyist for the movie industry, who's basically tried to introduce every conceivable conspiracy theory in the book as to why it is that what's bad for the movie industry is bad for you, because it's causing drugs, it's causing terrorism, it's causing climate change, it's causing kind of border controls, it's causing illegal migrations across Europe, that the Russian mafia are basically organising everything, that Jack Valante is kind of for decades, and he's lost. I mean, after 9/11, there was a huge dispute between the Republican administration and the Motion Picture Association of America around wanting to make neocon mega blockbusters. It took them about 5 years to get the Motion Picture Association of America to agree to actually give the films for free to the soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. But I would say that actually the Motion Picture Association of America is actually not very good. It spends a lot of money making a big noise, but I don't think they've actually been very successful at all. And the things that they've managed to kind of get through haven't necessarily been the things that have been good for them. The things that have been good for them is that cinema attendances are going up, despite the fact that you can get it for free. That actually making, and again, this is back to this thing about the information society is not an information economy. So you can watch that movie for free, but if you want to watch it with your friends, the one little video that I was going to show you that I couldn't, it's the kind of parody of the you wouldn't steal a handbag thing, and it's basically, it looks as though they're in a cinema when these two little guys are watching this cheesy video, and but then when the lights fade, they push the sofa back away from the television, and they put the lights on, and they're actually in their cheesy bedsit. So yeah, if you want that kind of nice, comfy atmosphere with the enormous kind of popcorn holder on the side now, you can go, but it's in a kind of regulated space. And the information society will be one where people pay to go to see it. They'll pay to go to the, in a well, people talk about deterritorialization and the network infrastructure and how it is that globalization is all about deregulation. But there'll be re-regulation and re-territorialization around live performance spaces, cinemas, and actually all the issues about city regeneration, city branding. It's all about making people reconnect in specific places. So I think the movie industry has a future in a way that the recording industry doesn't, and I don't think its lobbying is actually its lifeblood. And actually, Jack Valenti, his death may usher in a new era, but for 40 years he was their market kind of failure. I mean, he managed to keep going, but he never really won anything. But he kept on losing. The fact that he kept on being able to lose some more is illustrative of how successful the industry was, even if he wasn't.
Could I just add a brief thing to that? That's already happening in the music space. You mentioned art cinemas. Well, I'm a member of a chain of art cinemas, which is there's one in Oxford, and now they are routinely broadcasting live performances from the Metropolitan Opera, for which they charge £20 a ticket, and they are gaining a global audience of 350,000 people for one performance. And on top of that, everybody then wants to buy the DVD of the performance they've just watched. And on top of that, then they'll start buying recordings. And you're absolutely right that leveraging this fantastic advertising opportunity by looking at the flexible network system of distribution, you're absolutely right. It's all about the distribution system. But and that is, I think, the way ahead.
And the fact of the live event, it's interesting, like you say, if you can be watching the same live event in all different locations around the world, that wherein lies the kind of the attraction. And I think it is around that. It's a redefinition of creativity. That I was kind of thinking about, well, what is creativity? And there's all kinds of different conceptions of what it is. And people think creativity is good and they want more of it and they like to sort of indulge in it. And there's all kinds of different versions. There might be like I don't know, there's the Manhattan Project version of creativity where you get some very clever people and you manage them and you organize them in a structured way in order to achieve something that no one on their own could have achieved. And that was the record industry model. So not Brian Epstein, who's the Beatles' big producer? George Martin, he goes into the studio and he produces magic because he's this kind of the maestro. There's the sort of maestro, complex division of labour model if it's Oppenheimer or it's kind of that kind of, and that's the record industry model. They claim, well, we should have 90% of the return because we've organised all of this. But then you've got kind of the creative genius, the mad genius, kind of like what's all in his head sort of idea, the sort of Henry Fuseli, mad, bad, dangerous to know, romantic conception, misconception of genius. Then you've got kind of the idea of genius in the community, another counterposition in the Romantic movement, that there's the genius of the tradition, the community, whether it's the Mississippi Blues Delta or whether it's kind of like the German Volk or whatever it is that the Brothers Grimm were trying to discover, or whether it's the Lakeland, it's nature, it's kind of like the synthesis of nature, the harmony of whatever. So that's another conception of creativity. Then there's the idea of the jam session. So rather than just the individual genius, there's the kind of the synthesis of things that happen when you get a group of people together in a rather unstructured, free-form kind of way. And then there's the creativity of the live event, which is never to be repeated, can never be the same again, and that you were there, you were part of the magic. And I think, and this is worth, I think, further research, there is going to be a shift, and there is. I mean, I think if you talk to young people, what they think creativity is about that live event that they went to. It's not the perfectly mastered, when the Beatles brought out George Martin brought out the Love album, and it was that kind of totally digitally super mastered version of all the Beatles' greatest hits, totally seamlessly kind of like welded together, was kind of like seamlessly whatever together to make a perfect, seamless thing, which might be attractive to a particular kind of audience. But I think a younger generation, they think creativity is actually something messy, something that happens in a field or happens somewhere that no one, that they can talk about as if they were, because they were there and that they were part of it. And it's actually reconfiguring the notion of creativity. And I'd also say that in counterposition to a lot of the business models that say creativity only happens when you've got tightly controlled, digitally rights managed, or kind of copyright controlled, patented. This is my big project. My idea. What I want to do next is a book called Sharing: Crime Against Capitalism, which will be looking at the music industry, television, the pharmaceutical industry, academic publishing, issues around biodiversity, genetic modification, and there's another one that I can't remember. But anyway, that's my big picture.
Question in the back, yes.
Yeah, great. You just mentioned academic publishing. I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on publishing generally, or text-heavy content. I mean, you said the live performance in music is kind of where value is migrating to, and you've been talking about cinema in the movie industry. And what do you think where's value migrating to in the publishing industry? I mean, you also mentioned packaging and identification, and there's a whole bunch of these buzzwords. But yeah, ebooks is very much debated these days. So maybe you can just talk a bit about this.
Yes, I mean, publishing is obviously a very diverse collection of things. And if we take academic publishing out of it, where I think you can make a case for saying, well, academics publish despite not really making a lot of money because it helps their live performance, gets them promoted, gets them their jobs, and they're actually paid for live performance. In the case of fictional authors, the question of how you could imagine an alternative business model for fictional authors, well, most fictional authors do make most of their money from, if you're a poet, your written poetry is unlikely to ever pay the rent. You'll probably wind up working, whether it's in teaching or some kind of like workshops, or you'll be working in all kinds of various kind of organizations where you're encouraging others or you're working with others.
So what? So do you have still to give your points away for free?
Well, I don't think it's a question of, well, yes, it is a question that you will have to. It's that you are giving them away for free is probably what gets you booked. Actually, most poets make most money from live stand-up, yeah, basically. So poetry, it's very rare to make money from poetry unless you're doing stand-up, unless you're actually going out and performing it and delivering it. So yes, you should give it away. That's the only way you're going to get paid. It's the only way you ever did get paid. The idea that you were going to sit at home and, well, actually, interestingly, I did once include a quote from T.S. Eliot in a book, and I did have to pay his estate £40. So, yes, if you're T.S. Eliot, then maybe you can make a bit of money, but that's not a really viable business model for the vast majority of poets who are going to go out there and perform. And having their music, having their poetry out there in the world for free is actually the best means of them getting bookings, yes. Whether it's fictional writers, as in authors of fictional stories, books, novellas, novels, etc., it'll be interesting, I think. Well, playwrights, obviously, there's an interesting thing there about it would mean that playwrights would have to actually directly involve themselves in the production of their works in order to get paid. Although, having said that, the issues around composers, getting commissions, if you're a classical composer now, the way you're going to make a living is from commissions. You know, you're not going to make a big living out of your recordings, or sales of your recorded work. You're going to live off commissions and being kind of in residence. So again, it's more about performance. The question of how it is that novelists, I think novelists is you have an impression of kind of best-selling authors, making J.K. Rowling's, for example, but then that's not, well, okay, she makes a lot of money out of the current business model, but 99.9% of the other novelists don't. I would imagine that there will be more viable alternatives, and actually it will be worth exploring what those are.
Well, if the Kindle takes off, of course, it's cutting out the need to have published books whatsoever. I mean, you can have a digital distribution of a book that can be read on download materials and download devices. So then the possibilities of that are now starting to emerge.
And the issue of like who's prepared to pay, that actually people are prepared to pay for things that they connect with the artist or the author. So, for example, selling work that's actually connected directly to the author rather than mediated, wherein the author only gets a tiny percentage, I think that's a viable model. So self-publishing in some form or another. The question then of how it is that authors get publicity, well, again, it's back to free distribution. There will be all kinds of difficulties, and there will be, I think what we're going to have to accept is that some kinds of things that were created under the current arrangements would not have been created under new arrangements. So the Beatles' Love album would never have existed in the current arrangements. The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album, if the Beatles hadn't stopped touring in 1966, they wouldn't have made the Sgt. Pepper's album. Now, for those people who value the creativity of the live performance, they'd say, well, the Sgt. Pepper album wasn't particularly brilliant. It was a massive wrong direction for creativity, the concept album. But then again, if you're someone who lives and loves progressive rock music because of when you grew up, maybe you'll think this is the end of the world. But if you're a teenager who likes Muddy Fields, you might think that it's the beginning of a new world. But yes, some forms of creativity will be valued less in a free digital network society, and some forms of creativity will be valued more. But it's interesting, some things that would have been created would never have been created. But then many things that might be fabulous and wonderful will be created in the future. But they won't be what happened before, which is probably good.
I think we have to end, but hopefully you'll stay around for a while to talk to people individually. I'm very skeptical of the legal strategies, so I was really pleased that actually we've ended up talking about new business models, or what is the business model, which is actually the incentive structure for doing things. And I want to thank you. It was really, really very entertaining.